What's the most dangerous thing humans have ever done? Now you might say it's inventing the nuclear bomb, or thinking that Windows Vista was good for release. Maybe it was making Boris Johnson Prime Minister at the same time Donald Trump was president. But I think I know what the real answer is. In fact, I'm sure of it, because today I'm going to tell you about the biggest risk we have ever taken. I'm going to tell you a story about infections from another world, about how we tried to stop those infections and failed spectacularly. We took a risk and we didn't mitigate it through human ingenuity, we did it through sheer luck. This is the story of when we went to the moon, and more distressingly, when we came back. The story starts over 50 years ago with the moon landings. Now, I wasn't alive, but I know people who were, and they will all tell you the same thing, that you cannot underestimate just how incredible that time was. The space race, the ingenuity, the excitement, the awe, all eyes all over the world on one thing. It's unbelievable. But it wasn't all rosy, because there's a side to the moon landings that we don't really talk about anymore, a side which had people genuinely worried. Now, we've just had COVID, and you know what that's like. In fact, I want you to think back to when COVID began. Think back to the fear, the uncertainty, the unknown, the worry about what a pandemic can do and how many people it could kill. Well, in 1968, exactly the same thing was happening. The H3N2 influenza pandemic was in full force. That was also called the Hong Kong flu. Now, it lasted about 2 years, killed about 1 million people, and in America, 100,000 people died, mostly over 65s. At the same time, Michael Crichton's book, The Andromeda Strain, came out, which was about a world-ending pandemic from outer space. Now, it was a bestseller, and obviously people read it and they started to get scared. So what if a moon mission brought a deadly virus back? What if it turned into a pandemic and wiped out the human race? Well, if you were a postman at NASA, your day was about to get pretty busy. NASA actually had given some thought to this, and it has a name: backwards contamination. That's when we bring something from space back to Earth and into our biosphere, where the bugs could multiply, evolve, spread exponentially. It might cause a pandemic, or it could wipe out and replace some of the fauna and flora, and that would probably end the world as well. So when it came to the moon, well, through a telescope, it looks just like a rock. But is there a chance it could harbour life? Science fiction certainly thought through. There were a ton of books and films about space invasions and lunar organisms, maybe even advanced civilizations living up there right now. But, scientists didn't really think that lizards existed on the moon, but they were worried that there might be a teeny weeny, very slim chance that there were these little bugs. And if you're a scientist, you know that it's the little bugs that will kill you, not the big ones. Now, one of those scientists was actually Carl Sagan, who wrote an article in 1960, 20 years before he became the Carl Sagan. He learned about plagues from historian William McNeill, and it freaked him out. Although normally it was the explorer who took a pathogen to the indigenous population, think about Europeans taking smallpox to the Americans, rarely it could go the other way, i.e. backwards contamination. At the same time as Sagan, the Space Science Board of the prestigious National Academy of Sciences, or NAS, had warned that life was theoretically possible on other celestial bodies and recommended precautions be taken against that. That was pretty much ignored by the Project Mercury team, so in 1962 they doubled down with a report that noted, "The introduction into the Earth's biosphere of destructive alien organisms could be a disaster of enormous significance to mankind. We can conceive of no more tragically ironic consequence for our search for extraterrestrial life." Their recommendation was all about quarantining. Again, though this was kind of ignored by NASA, but not by the senators. More and more congressional staff started to worry and bombarded NASA with official questions about backwards contamination. This couldn't be ignored by NASA representatives, and they assured Congress that appropriate actions would be taken. A year later, in July 1964, that's 5 years before Apollo 11 and the first moon landing, the Department of Agriculture, the Army, the National Institutes of Health, the Public Health Service, major universities, prestigious institutes, and NASA held a 2-day conference devoted to the threat. It was called the Conference on Potential Hazards of Back Contamination from Planets, and I've linked it downstairs if you want to read the report. The crux of it was that Sagan was right.
And of course, you still got the cosmic connection, which is one of the all-time fascinating books. Thanks for being here. It's always a great kick. Lady gynecologist, you'll start when on your show?
Historically, when a population is introduced to a new virulent pathogen without immunity, it kills millions. Could a lunar microbe do the same? And with the ease of global travel now becoming a reality, could it be a world-ending pandemic? Now, what would you do about that? Well, if you think about it for a while, you'll probably come to the same conclusion the participants made, that it would be impossible to eliminate potential organisms stowed away on a spacecraft. We just didn't have the technology to do that, especially on a paper-thin lunar lander. The key would be to recognize the organism on Earth and stop it escaping until a vaccine was developed. That would involve something I'm sure you're all familiar with: quarantine. And I mean major quarantine. Not just the astronauts, but everything that came back. The shuttle, the rocks, the clothes, everything. The quarantine period should last at least 3 weeks because it takes a while for a virus to get going, and then we need to make sure we're giving sufficient time for the illness to develop. This is called the incubation period. At the time, 3 weeks seemed like a good guess, and that's potential mistake number one. Most viruses we know about tend to have their infection within 20 days, but that was before the AIDS pandemic and HIV, which showed that incubation periods could be up to 10 years or more. What's more, to verify that microbes could contaminate our biosphere, some of those priceless rocks needed to be ground to dust and exposed to plants, animals and tissues. Now, geologists weren't happy about that, as you can imagine. And it won't be the first time they're unhappy about something, but when you grind things to dust, dust gets everywhere. Anyway, there we go. Here's our plan. We need to bring astronauts back from the moon into a facility where they can be quarantined. And in that facility, we need to keep them safe. And we need to do experiments on them and on the quarantine rocks without spreading any potential virus to the outside world. And shit, no facility like that has ever been imagined, let alone built. Anyway, because bureaucracy and deadlines are a thing, time was running out. In fact, this never-before-imagined facility had to be built in 16 months, and then you'd have to test it, staff it, certify it. Now, in one of my other day jobs, I sometimes put walls up, and when you take into account planning and stakeholders and meetings, a wall can take a year to put up. So imagine trying to build a state-of-the-art lab that had never been built before. This was a proper wartime scramble. Now, at this time, I want to take a moment to tell you about how we make this kind of place nowadays. So you can keep it in your mind when we talk about what they tried to do in the 60s. Nowadays, the peak design is a biosafety level 4 facility. This is your horror movie disease facility. There are no treatments. All research is done in cabinets. Those cabinets have seamless edges with no sharp edges. Everyone doing research needs to wear positive pressure, tightly sealed suits with its own air supply, all of which is inside a lab, which is perfectly sealed with an air supply which vents the air into decontamination tanks. Now, this lab is behind airlocks, and the staff need to pass through that, removing their suits in decontamination areas, showering before going back into the outside world. Any filter system should filter down to 10 nanometers. That's 4 times the width of your DNA. Staff have to undergo intensive training to work anywhere in this kind of facility, and checks are carried out daily on almost every facet of the system.
Try to remain calm. Many people are dying and are going to continue to die unless we find this monkey.
Anyway, did the LRL have any of that? No, of course it didn't. But you can't blame anyone because nothing like this had ever happened before. Immediately in the planning stages, there were flaring tensions. The old war between geologists and biologists were kicking off. Geologists wanted a positive pressure room to examine rocks. That means it pushed the air out of the room, away from the rocks, so it could keep them free of earthly contamination. We have that kind of room in hospitals where we have immunocompromised patients and we don't want them catching illnesses from the outside world. But the biologists wanted negative pressure rooms, which would suck the air in towards the rocks, which would stop any infections from escaping, but would cover the rock in unearthly earth mess. Sense actually prevailed here, and for the second time, the geologists were pissed. Amazingly, by the summer of 1968, so 1 year before the moon landing, the LRL was finished, complete with negative pressure rooms. But no one had ever worked in a facility like this before, and no one had ever certified one. So in December, a chemist called John Hodge led a team of inspectors and identified 140 deficiencies. He characterised the management as generally sloppy and considered that the plans that had been put in place to handle samples were vague and lacking professional discipline, bordering on anarchy. So 140 problems with 7 months to go, and there was a mad rush from NASA to sort it out.
If you having girl problems, I feel bad for you, son. I got
over 140
problems, but a ain't one. I got the rat patrol on the...
But this led to one disaster after another. Despite top-down staff reorganisations and a change in ethos from nice-to-have modifications to just make sure it works. Anyway, in the month of February, an extraordinary spectacle unfolded within the biological testing wing as over 100 species of plants and animals were poised to embark on a daring encounter with a test version of moon dust. However, unforeseen circumstances led to the accidental release of dust into the parking lot. Amidst the chaotic turn of events, tragedy also struck the most unlikely of candidates. A minnow, reared in the sheltered confines of super clean isolation, succumbed to an external fungal infection. A few hours later, a germ-free mouse died of a parasitic infection. In March, there was a mass simulation and every single department failed. Every mouse died. Not a single bit of routine equipment worked properly. Autoclaves broke down and there was no way to repair them. If this had been real, not a single person working in the lab would have escaped unscathed, and everyone would have had to be quarantined.
We failed.
And then, of course, there was the staff, who needed to be trained even though there wasn't time. The LRL needed 200 technicians to work in the labs alongside hundreds of NASA staff who would come and go. Staff would have to remove their clothes, put lab stuff on, then when leaving, strip, shower, walk nude through UV lights, and then put their day clothes back on. Technicians had to agree that they would not attempt to break out of quarantine if exposed to lunar contaminants, and that their next of kin would not be able to claim their bodies if they died. In fact, if there was a dangerous outbreak, there were even plans to have armed guards seal the facility at gunpoint and bury it under a mountain of dirt and concrete. And yet, despite all these failings, things moved forward. The unstoppable force of the moon landing was impossible to stop. So things kept being pushed through at record speed, papering over cracks on an industrial level. One of those cracks was actually the pathogen that was tested on the facility. The safeguards had actually been designed around the deadliest pathogen that we knew about, Yersinia pestis, which is a bacterium responsible for the bubonic plague. But that's a bit of a bizarre choice, because that's quite a large bug that's evolved on Earth to invade the tropical rat flea and then spreads from the fleas to the humans, which is precisely not how an infection from space will spread. Hodge therefore suggested using Coxiella burnetii, which is a much smaller bacterium that causes Q fever. This can form spores resistant to environmental extremes and spreads due to aerosol transmission. That means it spread much easier and is a much better test of containment facility. But the idea of testing the facility with a live hazardous agent that could sicken thousands of people, including NASA employees, on the eve of the first lunar landing was seen as a pretty dumb thing to do, and the facility was never pushed to the extreme. As I mentioned before, the Hong Kong flu and Michael Crichton's Andromeda strain book both came out at precisely the wrong moment. The general public hadn't really interrogated things to date, but that was all about to change. Waves of letters bombarded NASA from the worried public, and this threatened to undo the meticulously cultivated image NASA has created for itself in the media.
People, calm down.
In June of 1969, so 1 month to go, Air Force Colonel John Pickering assured the media that the facility and procedures in place were well beyond the current state of the art. But nothing could be further from the truth. The ICBC had identified serious breaches in quarantine protocol even before the astronauts arrived at the LRL, basically meaning it would fail before the astronauts even got to the lab. According to the protocol, the capsule needed to be totally sealed once in the Earth's atmosphere. After splashdown, it would be hoisted, by crane onto an aircraft carrier. Worth pointing out that you better hope that nothing survived on the capsule could invade the ocean. Anyway, once on the aircraft carrier, an impervious tunnel would allow the astronauts to walk to a mobile quarantine facility, a retrofit Airstream travel trailer. If this was breached, the carrier would remain at sea indefinitely. If it didn't, then the trailer and the contents would be offloaded in Pearl Harbor and airlifted to Ellington Airfield Joint Reserve in Houston and trucked to the LRL. There, another impervious tunnel would allow astronauts to enter quarantine with their capsule and their rocks. Obviously, this was a foolproof plan. However, let's throw some spanners into the works. NASA officials decided that sealing the capsule threatened to suffocate or drown the astronauts. They'd have to vent the capsule into the atmosphere and disembark at sea. This was much safer for the astronauts, but you'd literally screwed the pooch at step one as far as quarantine was concerned. Maybe there was a compromise. NASA agreed a new plan. Yes, they'd vent the capsule, but the astronauts would also decontaminate their spacecraft, cleaning the moon dust into vacuums and filters, and Navy divers would toss biological isolation garments into the spaceship for the astronauts to wear before disembarking. All precautions being taken, a NASA press release assured the public. But back at the LRL, Sagan and molecular biologist Cyrus Leventhal had identified an even more serious breach. NASA's plan stipulated that quarantine at the LRL could be broken in the event of a medical emergency. Yes, if an astronaut got sick from space lurgies, they would be removed from quarantine and brought to a hospital, an idea so stupid it beggars belief at how it even got past the first draft. So it's July 1969 and we're about to land on the moon. Let's assess the situation. We identified a threat and realised it's a serious one. We've done a lot of planning and messed up quite a lot of that planning, but we've put a plan into place and we've actioned a facility that's failed every test. And yet, as astrobiologist Wolf Vishniak wrote, the Apollo program is moving at a pace that we cannot stop. The irresistible progress is being used to brush aside the inconvenient restraints of the quarantine program. So with that in mind, we have no choice. Let's go to the moon.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful, Samuel. It has a stark beauty all its own.
On the 20th of July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed in the Sea of Tranquility and stepped onto the surface of the moon. The world stopped. This is the greatest achievement in the history of the human race. When they returned to sleep, they slowly pressurized their lunar lander, and as they took off their helmets, they could smell the moon dust. According to Armstrong, it had the scent of wet ashes, and Aldrin, akin to the smell of the air after a firecracker has gone off. Lunar dust, it seemed, was a real pain in the arse, and it got everywhere. All over the lander, the suits, the skin. Lunar dust is said to be like graphite, but more abrasive. It's horribly itchy and irritating to breathe. In fact, the duo would end up sleeping in their helmets and gloves at night. Had this contained microbes, it would have been impossible not to have got infected. When they got back to Earth, that dust was everywhere too, even on their isolation garments as they got out of the ocean. These garments had salt water on them, by the way, which means they leaked, another breach. But anyway, when they arrived in Houston, they were about to begin their 3-week quarantine. A NASA photo technician called Terry Slezak picked up a film cassette retrieved from the moon and suddenly noticed that his hand was covered in moon dust. That cassette, it turns out, had been dropped on the moon's surface and wasn't as clean as people thought. Slezak and 5 others joined the 3 astronauts in quarantine. Other breaches soon followed. On the 27th of July, a bag holding lunar samples sprung a leak. On the 28th, a biocabinet glove ripped open on a quail cage. On the 29th, gas was seen bubbling from bathroom fixtures in one of the labs. On the 30th, there was a gas breakdown that caused drinking fountains to froth and bubble. And on the 31st, some spacesuit gloves just ruptured and 2 more technicians joined the quarantine. More incidents happened on the 2nd, 3rd, 5th and 6th of August, and by that time there were 19 people in quarantine. Needless to say that if moon rocks had harboured a pathogen, it would have got out. Did NASA tell the public about any of this? No. Fortunately, no one was getting sick. In fact, the main complaint was boredom, though Neil Armstrong remembers it being quite pleasant, as it was a welcome reprieve from the public eye. Everyone was released from quarantine after 3 weeks, with fortunately no Earth-ending disease. A couple of months later, Pete Conrad piloted Apollo 12 and the team went out to the Surveyor 3 craft, which had arrived on the moon 2 years earlier. They wanted to see how well tech survived on the moon and detach the probe's camera. According to Conrad, after they did this, they were filthy. And when Apollo 12 was in quarantine, there were even more breaches at the LRL and 11 geologists joined the astronauts this time. Again, NASA kept stum. Oh, and a bit later on, LRL scientists found bacteria on the Surveyor 3 camera. This was Streptococcus mitis, a well-known Earth bug that lives in your lungs. It must have come from a technician on Earth and then survived on the moon for 2 years. As Conrad later reflected,
when I found out that they found the little bacteria that was in the Surveyor camera that had made it from Earth all the way to the moon in the Surveyor camera and stayed there for 33 months and plus or minus 250 degree temperature spread and took all the radiation from the sun and all the rest of it and came back to Earth on Apollo 12 and came back alive. You know, I thought that was one of the more significant things, but I don't think anybody else did. They wrote a nice report on it, and that was it.
Anyway, what's clear is that if a pathogenic microorganism had existed on the moon, then NASA wouldn't have contained them. Astronauts would have been infected. It would have breached quarantine. It would have infected the world. And it's just dumb luck that all there was up there was dust. We now know that the moon is lifeless, though our imminent return there holds a certain charm and will do wonders for the lunar hotel tourist industry. But our sights are set on grander destinations, meteors, Mars and Venus, places with a much greater chance of harbouring life. And guess what? We're going there too. In July 2020, 51 years after the first moon landing, NASA issued a directive protecting Earth from space infections during our daring human missions to Mars. But here's the burning question. Can we ever truly ensure Earth safety? Sure, we can plan, we can use advanced technology, we can react quicker, but absolute certainty? I'm not so sure. So perhaps the most audacious act the human race ever committed was going to the moon and coming back. But brace yourselves, because in the next 10 years, we're going to turn that dial up to 11.
Turn it up! Turn it up!
But hey, what's the worst that can happen? Anyway, that's it for today. I'll see you next time. Hopefully.
How is the quality of the TV?
Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the